Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board. I will call this meeting to order at 9:33, and we do have a quorum. So thank you for everybody who came out. That's great. We can proceed with our work today. All right. Hope everyone is doing well and staying warm and enjoyed not having to go outside today. So that's good to get here. So kind of a bonus. All right. So let's just dive right in. So we have recognition of guests. Do we have any guests that are here? If so, please come off mic and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jamie Sapia. I'm here to give public comment on the proposed certification regulations.
All right, wonderful. And that's going to be up next.
And
Great.
Addison Smith has joined us. She is the Educator Data Coordinator at MSDE.
All right, wonderful. Thank you to have, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, well, moving into public comment, it looked as though we had two public comment, I think. One came in just a little bit late. The first was from MSEA. Is there anyone here to give that public comment?
Yes, I am.
You are. Yep. Okay, great.
Hi. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, good. Well, my name's Jamie Sapia, and I'm in-house counsel for the Maryland State Education Association. So we just want to give a couple of comments on behalf of the association regarding the proposed regulations, amendments to COMAR 13A 12.6 for consideration prior to adoption. So as always, MSCA would like to acknowledge and thank the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board for helping to ensure Maryland students have the resources and support necessary to be successful and achieve their highest potential. One of these resources, of course, is to be instructed by highly skilled professional educators who strive to provide the best possible learning environment for all students across the state. And we do understand that appropriate certifications are necessary to validate an educator's qualifications, but we do need to ensure that the requirements under COMAR don't violate basic due process rights. So as written, the proposed changes to 13A 12.6.3I1B, that is a lot. That's on page 4 of the proposed amendments. Specifically, the amendment placing a flag on a certificate holder who is under investigation to determine whether grounds exist for denial or disciplinary action are extremely problematic. Placing a flag next to an educator's name before there's even a determination that action against his or her license would be appropriate is completely inappropriate, and it's inconsistent with basic elements of due process. So in short, if we were to adopt this amendment, a teacher is essentially guilty until proven innocent, and this really turns the fundamental principles of due process on its head. Furthermore, placing such a flag at the outset of an investigation would really create an administrative nightmare. Who's placing the flag? What's required to remove the flag? At what point is removal even possible? How much extra time are the LEAs going to have to spend reporting teachers who've just been accused of misconduct before even determining whether the employee engaged in such acts? So what is the purpose of a flag when the employee remains under contract with the school system? This amendment really does absolutely nothing to protect students, and instead it creates unnecessary hurdles for local school systems and educators, many of whom find themselves at the center of an investigation for arbitrary or false claims. In closing, we would recommend that the Professional Standards and Teacher Education Board reject these proposed amendments to the regulations, given that these changes would run afoul of an employee's basic right to due process. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And I would instruct the members of the board that we have a hard copy of these comments as well.
Thank you.
That was sent out by Kelly. All right, thank you so much for being here. And of course, everybody knows that's something that's on our agenda after the break. So we'll get to that later. Thank you again for your comments. And then second, I believe we got a comment from Alita Jerry Carter. Is Ms. Carter here?
No, Mr. Hornbeck, she could not make it this morning, so she asked that we review her written comments.
Okay, and those I believe, Kelly, you just sent out recently. So if that was something you didn't see or that was puzzling to you, it just went out. So I would recommend that each person take a few minutes, take a look at those comments when you can, and then we can always come back for conversation on those. All right, did we have any other public comment for today?
No, sir.
Okay, all right, seeing none, we'll go on to the state board update.
I think we're about 5 minutes early, so Hannah has not joined us yet.
Okay, all right, that is fine. Well, then I'll tell you what, let's just go to the January minutes. So if you can pull those out, you got a hard copy of those as well. Let's take a look at those and I'll entertain a motion to adopt those, and then we can discuss any changes that need to be made. And I'll just give everybody a few minutes to take a look at those. All right, does anybody see any additions, changes, deletions that need to be made?
I was not virtual in January.
All right, so Ms. Hanley was not virtual, so that will be one change. Anybody else? All right, so I'll entertain a motion to adopt the January minutes with the changes noted.
So moved. This is Dr. Taylor.
Great, so moved by Dr. Taylor. Do we have a second?
Second,
The second that was too fast.
me.
Okay, all right, so
Serena.
this is Ms. Hanley. Yeah, so when you come off mic, if you can just say your name. And by the way, let's avoid using chat. That's a little bit hard to follow. So it's always a little messy when we're online and have so many people, but just feel free to come off chat and that'll do that. All right, so we have a second by Ms. Hanley. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, do we have any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, then the January minutes. Like a disco reverb there for a little bit. All right, so we do have our January minutes. Those have been approved. All right, that's fantastic. Now let's move on. I'll tell you what, we'll cycle back again. Communications update. Do we have anything for that?
If I could, Darren, just really quickly, since we don't have an agenda item today, just wanted to let the board know that the work group that this board asked MSDE to put together to look at licensure pathways for fine arts has been established. Unfortunately, the first meeting was scheduled for the day this week that we had snow. So it will take place in a week or so, but we've got a great group of experts from around the state who have volunteered to be a part of that group. So we're excited about starting that work.
All right, that's fantastic and completely understandable considering the weather. I can also add on a different note, Dr. Shockley and I did receive a letter from one person in the public who was asking about PSTEB's website. And the gist of it largely was, could the website do a better job at posting the materials that are going to be used for each meeting ahead of each meeting? And that seemed like a reasonable request. That's usually what happens with the state board. And I know sometimes folks will, email each of us and ask if, we can send the documents over. Kelly, is that something we could probably do?
So we should probably talk offline. Posting all of the documentation requires a lot of accessibility review. It's not something that's required by law. What's required by law is that we post the agenda and that we post meeting minutes or have live minutes. So yes, to answer your question, it can be done. It takes a workflow and human capital. And that workflow has not been established. So I need to speak internally to see if that's an option. Again, everything that's posted on our website has to be accessible and meet accessibility laws. So it is a lift, and there is a reason why we've never done it.
Mhm. Okay, I see. All right, well, perhaps that's something that Ms. Shockley and I can discuss with you later and just explore it a little bit, see what the options are, and then kind of report back to the board. All right. Anybody else with anything in communications?
This is communications, but also more in the form of an announcement. On February 25th, is that my background? No, okay. First of all, good morning. On February 25th, the University of Maryland, College Park will be holding a convening Transforming Education Systems for Teacher Diversity. And I just wanted to announce that. And additionally, on March 14th, the University of Maryland will be joining with some leaders around the state for Pi Day. And so please look for that information. We'll be sure to send it out to the PSTEB board, and you are certainly invited. Thank you so much.
Well, that's great. I saw a lot of smiles. Brings back a lot of memories of high school Pi Day, which we still do. So fantastic. All right, that's great. Anybody else? Kelly, I have a question. This is not so much communication, but just a question. Will we be, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ms.
Sorry. I think we're kind of doing little announcements. I just want to say I was looking at my AIB February update, and I saw a picture of our very own Sandy, and it was a great picture. Was it, were you part of the group for NC? I get that wrong, but the National Board Certification, are you newly certified? Like, what's going on?
No, I'm not newly certified. I've been certified since 2000, but we went down to the State House. I'm assuming that's what that picture is.
Yeah.
We went down to the State House and we were talking to senators and delegates, just kind of keeping the funding going for National Board. So
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to give a shout out because I was like, I know her.
well, thank you.
Like, my friend. So yeah, way to go.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Kelly, in the future, are we going to be having legislative updates?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay. All right. So I think we'll probably put that on for the next time. I did want to mention as part of the communications, House Bill 888 is something that members of this board might be interested in kind of following. So it's sort of new. If you're new to the board, we have struggled over the portfolio-based assessment and the requirement of it and so forth for quite a little while. And so that's kind of been an ongoing thing for this board. House Bill 888 is introduced to try and produce a little bit more clarity to that. So something that one might want to follow a little bit. They had changed it. The previous law had put it so that the portfolio-based assessment would not necessarily be required if a candidate was part of an induction program that did portfolio-based work. However, it did not excuse that from higher education. So that was a discrepancy I know that the board had been concerned about. And so House Bill 888 is an attempt to sort of kind of produce equity with that. We certainly did not want to, at any point, this board never wanted to take away the ability of the school to use portfolio-based assessments. But we did want to say if it's already something that's part of what a school is doing or part of what an induction program is doing, that the product wouldn't necessarily be required. And at one point, historically, this board had researched it, written a letter based on a lot of research that had been conducted as to the efficacy of it, the effect that it has on minority candidates, the cost, and so forth. So anyway, just something to sort of keep an eye on as this goes through. And I just wanted to draw that to folks' attention because we had spent a lot of time on that one. All right. Any questions or comments in addition to our communications update?
I'd like to just add one more thing. This isn't necessarily, this is not a legislative update, but it does impact policy.
Not something
Oh.
that like, you know, like,
Okay.
this is the case for everything. Yeah, cause like, that's what my goal.
Last time you need to mute yourself.
Okay, I think we might have a mic that's on that's giving us some background. So if you could maybe mute and then come off when you're ready to talk, that would be great.
Okay.
Dr. Shockley, go ahead.
Sure. We had the privilege of hearing from the literacy team from MSDE in the fall and talked about the literacy policy Right now, the math policy is also open for public comment, and I think that it is of interest to us because we are also preparing math teachers, and so it's available for public comment. If you check out the MSDE website, I think that that's interesting and helpful information. Excuse me. And I believe that the deadline is February 25th or 26th. I can look at my notes, but the window is still open if you'd like to take a look. I think that's really important to the board to be able to have a look at the draft and weigh in for the future of mathematics in Maryland. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, are we ready now for the state board update?
Yes, Ms. Oakley is with us.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Happy snowy Thursday, although right now it is rainy where I am, so you know. It is good to see you all. I wanted to just go over a few of the action items that we had a joint meeting with AIB and the state board last month. And apologies for the background noise. My cat is just choosing now to play with her very loud toy. So last month, us and the AIB unanimously adopted the implementation of the pre-K mixed delivery system policy draft. We made a few minor alterations to it, but it ultimately did pass. And that is just a kind of policy document. It is not regulations or anything more than just kind of a statement. We also passed a number of COMAR items on our consent calendar. I'll pull out one that got that is relevant for this group, but and got pulled out from the consent calendar, but did still ultimately pass. So the ones that passed on the consent calendar cleanly were the Purple Star schools, the pathways to teacher licensure, reportable offenses, educator licensure, the outdoor nature-based childcare license pilot program. And then we had a couple of calendar modifications and waivers from LEAs. One that did get pulled out from the consent calendar and had a little bit more of a discussion around was the let's see, and now I've lost it, was the incentive program for certification by the national board. So although that did still ultimately pass, it did get pulled out because a board member expressed concerns that there wasn't a strong enough alignment between the certification program for the national board and our state's focus on the science of reading. So Dr. Smith at MSDE said that they had talked to National Board to try to correct this issue and bring in more of a science of reading focus. And the NBC ultimately did not choose to do that. So our board member requested some work from MSDE to explore alignment there and just see kind of a crosswalk between the science of reading in the state and the NBC program standards. So that will be a follow-up piece that was requested by our board, even though, as I said, that ultimately still did pass. We also voted to unanimously adopt the 5-level pre-K sliding scale methodology to ensure that no family pays more than 7% of their income for public pre-K or for pre-K. We did grant permission to publish 2 COMAR items, one, the comprehensive teacher induction program, and the incorporation by reference, which comes before us frequently. So a lot of COMAR items came to, especially relative, pertinent for this board, came to the board last month, and we voted to approve all of them. And I believe we sent the summary of actions that we put together after every meeting to this group. But let me know. I'm happy to forward it to any folks that didn't get it or haven't seen it yet. And that is it, but happy to answer any questions.
I don't remember seeing the state board report for the meeting.
Okay, that might be on me. I will send it to Kelly, and then we can circulate it among this group. Apologies for that.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments? Just feel free to come off mic.
And I did want to just add, building on the math policy, we will have an hour in our February meeting dedicated, similar to what we did with the literacy policy, dedicated to public comment and discussion. So that, I believe, is going out this week. So feel free to sign up, and I can also circulate that notice with Kelly if this group is interested.
Thank you, Hannah. I do have just a question regarding the discussion around the MBCT and the science of reading alignment conversation. In a review of other IHGs and in a review of what some other states have done in seeking alignment, there is just some language that has caused, as you experienced, some conversation. Did the state board say, have a window of time for when they would come back to that conversation? I know that it passed, but I know that was also follow-up. Do we know when the follow-up will happen, or when the update will come? It sounds like MBCT denied the request for any changes.
They did, and our board member during that agenda item and at the end requested a report back on MSDE's interaction with NBC and MSDE. And so I assume that will come back in our February meeting, although that might happen offline. I can get more information on that. And also I can add that to my list of things to share with Kelly, if that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. And I have the phrasing that is causing some discussion if anybody's interested as well. We've been in conversations around the same things. Thank you for sharing that, Hannah.
Of course.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, Ms. Oakley, thank you so much for giving us that important information. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you all. I will see you next month.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks. All right, next on our agenda is the career ladder license principal tier criteria. And you might remember a document like this went out. So if you want to pull that up, that was an excellent summary of where we are on that and the recommendations that were made by the work group. So if you want to pull those up, and I'll defer to Kelly to take us through that.
Since we didn't get through the entire document, would it be helpful for me just to quickly review the notes I already have? Great.
Excuse me, is it also possible, as I'm looking through documents online, can you put the title of the document in the chat? That way I can find it.
Sure. You're going to be looking for the document that says proposed recommendations at the very top. And then underneath that, it says criteria to move to the licensed principal tier. Great. Okay. So starting at the top, from the last meeting, I have my first note from the group is a question, which is, should the evaluation be standardized across the state? We're talking about educator evaluations. Should educator evaluations be standardized across the state so that they're equitable? How do we know, how do you do this while leaving autonomy for LEAs? So there was some discussion about guardrails, because you're going to see in the recommendations that one of the requirements that's in the law is that an individual have an effective evaluation in order to move to any level of the career ladder. So there was some discussion about that, and I noted that that's a question worth asking. Next, I have if you look at in the first section under criteria to move to the licensed principal tier, if you look at number 4, I've made a note that is it reasonable to have teacher leaders, other licensed principals, and distinguished principals in the county providing a list of qualified candidates to the local superintendent as part of the process of choosing an individual to move into this position? Logistically, is that feasible? I also have noted in this bullet point, number 4, LEA should continue to define what ready to take on responsibilities looks like. There's a recommendation to change to candidate is recommended by the teacher leaders, other licensed principals, and distinguished principals, and on a list of qualified candidates provided to the local superintendent, which is verbatim from the law. So I think what I heard from this group is, let's just put the law language in there so it's crystal clear that that's why this piece is here. And then I also have a question, still the same, number 4. How will the AIB and MSDE ensure that the process that's developed, that process of having all those individuals weigh in, is equitable? And the recommendation that MSDE provide guidance on how to develop this type of process once this is published. Moving to number 5, I have a note that the board supports this. And that all principals should be required to go through induction. And then that's where we left off. So we had gotten through the criteria and we had yet to go into the proposed NBC waiver process section. But before I do that, you've had this document now for quite some time. Is there any other feedback regarding the criteria to move to the licensed principal tier, or questions about the work group's recommendations?
I just have one question. Can you differentiate for us between what it says under 1B, 27 months of effective experience, and number 3, effective evaluation? How are they distinct?
Sure. So number 1 is all about licensure. And so what I attempted to do here is just very high level. Those are the 3 components that are required to meet the licensure for administrators. So you have to have at least a master's degree. You have to have 27 months of experience as a teacher or specialist. And then you have to meet one of the 4 or 5 pathways to licensure. So that's all within that licensure bucket. And then moving on, the effective evaluation is what is required the year before. You need an effective performance evaluation in order to move up the career ladder, regardless of whether you're moving from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Regarding feedback, Kelly, the 2 questions that came back were, one was about how the guidelines will offer a pathway for out-of-state administrators and where that could live in a document. And then the other one was just simple, that we don't have a number 6. And I'm sure we will have one, but that was just a note.
What do you mean by a number 6?
We have 7 proposed recommendations for criteria to move to licensed principal tier, but it's enumerated to 8. So we basically went from 5 to 7. That's all.
Oh, you know what? I corrected that last month. So you still have last month's version. I have it. I got it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
There
Okay.
will only be 7.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And what happened was, when that was noticed, that's when the idea came, well, maybe number 6 could be about how we think about out of state. So those conversations happen at the same time from our programs that offer this particular pathway for licensure. Thank you.
Right. So I do want to take a moment, because there's such a connection between the licensure component and this, and there's a lot of confusion, rightly so. around the differences. So I do want to take a minute to make sure everyone understands. That number one in the criteria, that is the licensure piece. And those of you who were here last month, you saw the licensure regulations, the amended recommendations, and this board did in fact vote to publish those recommended amendments for public comment. And then they are slated to go to the State Board of Education on the 25th of this month, and they will be asked to do the same thing. Those licensure requirements have several, I think it's 5 pathways at this point. I'm not looking at them, so I apologize. And there are 3 pathways out of the 5 for individuals who are coming from out of state. So please know that the criteria that we're looking at now does not eliminate the ability of someone coming from out of state to come to Maryland and be qualified to move to the licensed principal tier of the career ladder. So I do want to make that clear. With that being said, you're going to see as we get into the waiver process that there's some explicit situations where the work group does want to think about out of state professionals, principals who have already demonstrated that they are effective principals. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but please know that there is absolutely a way to go onto level 4 if you are coming from out of state.
One other comment that came from the feedback group was because some information lives in different places, and so routing folks to the right place, which I think maybe came to the website comment from earlier. I'm not really sure, but there are also questions about the connection to the Principal Academy, and that came from another group. I think that actually came from MACD. Deb, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. So those are my feedback comments, and thank you.
Is there something that this board needs me to note for a recommendation based on what Dr. Shockley just shared? Because I'm taking notes. Or is it just to be mindful? Okay. Okay.
I got the sense that it was a be mindful as I was receiving the feedback.
Understood. Okay. All right, then let's move on to the proposed NBC waiver process. So as a reminder, the statute currently states that starting July 1st, 2029, in order to move up to the licensed principal tier, you see it in the criteria under the 6, yours probably says 7 incorrectly, that NBC is a statutory requirement. But the law also goes on to say that the State Board of Education, when they develop the criteria to move to this level, will also develop the conditions that are appropriate for a waiver of that NBC piece specifically. So the state work group also had a lot of conversation about this piece. I would, and I know I've shared this previously, the work group had a lot of strong feelings about the fact that this is a requirement, but it is a requirement. And so they understood the assignment. They knew that we needed to come up with the conditions for waiver. But I would be remiss if I did not share on behalf of the work group that there was a tremendous amount of discussion about the fact that that this is required beginning July 1st, 2029 for all principals. Principals that, by the way, have then step into the assignment, not principals that are already in the assignment. The AIB has recently come out and shared that their interpretation is that it does not affect sitting principals. It's if you move into this position beginning July 1st, 2029. So with that said, the work group came up with the following conditions for a potential waiver of just that NBC component. The first condition is that the candidate is not able to earn an NBC because there's no NBC available for them. So for example, all of our world language teachers that are outside of Spanish and French, currently there is not an option to get an NBC for them. That's the biggest group. Our specialists like social workers or speech language pathologists who have never had experience in teaching and it's not appropriate for them to seek a teaching NBC, you know, they don't have access to that. Sorry, my phone's ringing. So that's number one. Any comments, recommendations, suggestions for number one?
I have, I guess, a question, but I feel like it's a loaded question, so I'm sorry. I feel like for number one, then, one of the areas that NBC does not offer is an admin licensure. A lot of the components of NBC fit a teacher role, and talking to some of our local administrators down here, they really felt like it took away from the teachers that put in all of the work for NBC if they're just kind of faking it by going into a classroom to complete the components versus truly going through the program. So I question if admin is not one of those areas of licensure that doesn't quite fit.
Okay, and I may put our resident NBC on the spot here, and so I'm giving you a heads up, Sandy. And if you can't answer it, I'm happy to ask Melissa Chandler, NBC State Coordinator, to come into the next meeting to share just like an overview of what that looks like. Because common question is, how is a sitting administrator, like a vice principal, going to accomplish this candidacy? So to your first point, Ms. Carpenter, there is no administration NBC. It is a national board certificate designed for teaching areas. And the intent behind the law is that we want strong instructional leaders in our vice principal and principal positions. And so the intent of the law is that you come up through becoming an NBC teacher, and then you step into that assistant principal or principal role. We know that doesn't always happen, especially with our specialists who just don't come up the teaching way, but that is the intent of the law. As far as it not being a full candidacy, I'm going to have to push back a little bit there. Now, I'm not an NBCT. But I know a lot about the candidacy because I worked with the program for the last decade, and what an individual needs to accomplish, whether they're sitting as an AP or whether they're teaching in the classroom, is the same. So they have to complete the same amount of work, the same portfolios, and they need to have the same access to the children. It's how they have the access to the students that may look different. You do not have to be a teacher of record in order to use students in the portfolio process, but you also can't use like after school and tutoring. There are some parameters around it. So it's absolutely logistically feasible. So I don't want to send the message, great. I mean, I absolutely understand why you might think that, but I do want to dispel that myth that that an individual in an AP position would kind of get off easier in the candidacy and not have that same robust experience. Sandy, did you want to add anything? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I would agree 100%. There's often people that have moved into other leadership roles, specialists, for instance, that come and they they have to be if they're like doing maintenance of certification or something like that, or if they're partway through the process, and then they get moved into another position, that they go into a classroom and use those students in a classroom. And I wouldn't say, I know you used the word faking it, because I would disagree with that, because it really still even takes a lot of additional work if you're going to use a classroom you're not there every day, because you will need to go there more frequently. You'll need to work with those students in order to make it a genuine experience for you and those students. There are three portfolio, of the four, three of them require that you work with students. Two of them require that you do written work with students, and then you provide that work and show that and your reflections on that work. And then one of the components has 2 videos, and then another component has doing assessments with students. So it's not really, I mean, you really have to go through the full process. Now, whether you're there for a couple days a week for a month, or you're there the whole time, it's still the same process. Does that help?
I do want to clarify that the faking it comment came directly from an administrator who felt like it wasn't giving the respect that the program deserves because they could pick the best class, because of the time constraints they would really have. I think too, there's some concerns about not getting the collaborative time that was originally promised, and some of the backstepping that's happening on that right now. And so not being able to have that consistent habitual work with the same group of students is just a concern that administrators are expressing.
And also, teachers don't necessarily choose their best group to do this with, because actually you don't get the best reflection if you use your top flyers. I'll be honest with you. Your best reflection happens with, an average group of students.
Well,
And so that's not even encouraged. That's not encouraged to do.
but that was the point, that the teachers don't have the choices like the administrator would have the choices to kind of,
Well, even if they had the choice, it wouldn't be the best thing for their portfolios. I've been working with it for a long time, and I would suggest that's not the best. So, did that help? Anybody else have a question or follow up? Okay.
Any other feedback for number 1? Okay. Number 2, the list of qualified candidates does not include, so we're talking about now that list of, if you pop back up to the criteria and you look at 4, and we had a lot of comments around this, and so I'm going to actually just read you again what the statutory language is, because it's not on your sheet. It says, candidate is recommended by the teacher leaders, other licensed principals, and distinguished principals, and on a list of qualified candidates provided to the local superintendent. So this condition references that list. And what the condition is that you get the list of qualified candidates, it's provided to the local superintendent, and it does not include an MBCT because there are not enough individuals in the pool for there to be an MBCT. So basically they've met all the other requirements, but they haven't gotten MBC. The group was concerned about, and rightly so, the time that it's going to take to build our MBCT workforce. We are building it. I think we practically doubled it last year, but it's still a very small percentage of our teacher workforce. So, knowing that, they wanted to build in a condition that there may be times when you're looking to fill a principal position and you simply don't have an NBCT who has applied for that position and then meets all the other requirements. So they did not want to set up a situation where the local can't hire because there's a barrier. So that's where this condition is coming from.
So Kelly, I think my question for this one is, so then are they required to then go through the process once they take a principal position?
So the way that it's currently written, Sandy, is it's a waiver. So the work group did not make any type of recommendation regarding that the waiver be temporary in nature. We haven't had a chance to share this with the state board yet. That's why we're soliciting all of this feedback first. So it's a potential that type of recommendation could come out, but the statewide work group did not make that recommendation. So it would be a waiver.
Okay.
All right, let's move to number 3.
Sorry, I couldn't find it fast enough. So for a waiver then, waivers are reapplied for each year if they're not permanent? Just to understand waivers.
So this is a new waiver process. It's not, because we're used to kind of like the waiver of licensure process, which, it's waived, it's waived. This is an employment waiver. So this is, we're going to waive a condition of employment that is in law in order to allow you to take that position. So the statewide work group has looked at this waiver process, and quite frankly, I think we've all interpreted the language of the law to mean that if it's waived, it's waived, and you're waived as long as you're in that position. So I don't see a need for a continuous re-waiver. And I'm speaking logistically from an MSDE hat perspective, I see this as a one-time waiver. The state board could disagree with me. Are there any thoughts from this board, pros and cons? Do we think that this should be a waiver that is one time? Do we think that it should be renewed? I'm happy to take any notes and recommendations from the board.
If I may, I know that there were individuals on this team that participated, I believe, in the administrator work group, and I'm curious if some of the feedback from PSAM was considered and included. I think that the PSAM, and I know we have I think Dr. Dyson's here, okay, had some concerns, comments about this NBCT waiver. And so I wonder if I think that's right, but I might not be right. So I should yield to Dr. Dyson. But I believe that maybe we could, from what I understand, that the NBCT inclusion in just the career ladder language was not overwhelmingly seen as advantageous for the administrator track. And if that is the case, then maybe the waiver, the ongoing waiver could be responsive to that conversation. But I will ask someone else to weigh in on that.
Thank you for bringing it up, Ebony, and good morning. I'm going to pull out our recommendations. One of the challenges we had with that, just from a fiscal perspective, was that while we give the $10,000 stipend to teachers, that was not going to be offered to administrators. So that was one of our major issues with that. We were okay with the waiver piece, and I think I shared a couple of comments at our last meeting just regarding some nuances around who would determine when the time frame was and things like that. But really, the concern was that it was really an unfunded initiative for administrators, and we were satisfied with the waiver process.
Thank you.
Shall I move on?
I just wanted to make, I guess, a quick comment. I just feel like, trying to figure out how to phrase this. I feel it's a little dangerous because it's almost like it's like opposed to the intent of the law to get more MBCTs. So that if like you're saying that there's this list of qualified candidates, does it impact who gets put on that list? You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if it's, do they avoid putting people on the list if they were MBCT, if they're trying to get other people hired into that position? So I just feel like it's a little dangerous without like a stipulation that then you become national board certified.
This is Kim. I would have to agree. I was thinking, I wanted to listen to all the comments first, but I was thinking so as well, that I think it would be important to have some sort of, like you said, stipulation that, okay, we had to hire this person, there was no one available, but within 5 years or at your next evaluation, that you have to show that you are going to, because if it's going to be something that is mandated in law that we want our admins to have these qualifications, then we don't want someone to just get in without doing it because there was nothing else there, and then they don't have to worry about doing it. I think if it's going to be something that we require of them, then we should make sure that they will be on a pathway to get it.
Can I ask a question about funding for, I had heard that there were issues, there were concerns about getting funding for the national board process for our admin, whereas teachers get help and support from the state and from local. Is that something that is done by MSDE to help fund NBC?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about the fee incentive waiver, or the fee incentive program. Sometimes it's referred to as like the candidacy scholarship. So the law did change in 2023, I believe. It was a bill in 2023 that added additional eligible employees to take part in the program. And it actually kind of took us back to where we used to be before the blueprint. So at this point, I think it's called non-teacher in the law, so administrators are on that list. There's a list, and it's actually in the regulations that were just adopted during the January meeting, and I'm happy to send those out to this group. So we do fund the candidacy for administrators, but that is new again, because there were a couple years there when the blueprint was adopted where we stopped funding the candidacy for those individuals, but they can be funded now again. So I've heard some comments. I think what I've heard, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are some board members who are concerned that the condition of number 2 isn't that it's a forever waiver when it's simply because there aren't enough NBCTs, and then that could potentially set up a situation where there's some inequity across the state and potential for the individuals who are creating those lists of eligible candidates to avoid the MBCTs in an effort to move them up the ladder. So I need to ask, and I'll turn to Chair Hornbeck, I need to ask if this is, if the majority of the board feels that we should make a recommendation here, and if so, what is that recommendation?
Kelly, could I ask a question? On the teacher side, how does the waiver process work? I understand that if a teacher is moving into the career ladder, and I'm not talking about administrators, I'm talking about teachers. If a teacher is moving into the career ladder, they can get a waiver if there is no MBC for the area that they teach. Is that correct?
No. So the only waiver carve out is for this licensed principal tier. The statute is explicit that you may move up the career ladder as a teacher if you either have a national board certificate or there is no national board certificate that is comparable, then you have to have a master's degree in your subject area. So it is very explicit what needs to happen in that instance. You're only going to see a waiver process in the law when it comes to the licensed principal tier.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm just looking to make sure that there's fidelity between the two, that we're not holding one to one standard and one to a different standard when we do this. That was more where that question came from. And we already had, to go back to the notes that you shared with us, there was that concern about effective evaluation versus highly effective evaluation as a gatekeeper. And we all understand why we can't use the word highly effective, because there's no universal definition of what that is. So I understand that. That's one of the first sort of, in my mind, breakdowns by which the screening process to get the best people into administration isn't quite necessarily going to be there, because there's no way for us to do it. And I can understand when people on the board raise concerns that once you get through that, you could just be effective. You couldn't be highly effective. Maybe you're just effective. Okay, so you get through, you're not necessarily a highly effective teacher and you get in. You may not necessarily, for one reason or another, have an MBC, and then you get a waiver, and then you never have to get one. And those two together, I think, could pose some concerns for quality and quality control. So again, I echo Kelly's question. Is this something that the board feels strongly enough about that we want to vote to give a recommendation for this? In other words, are we comfortable making the waiver permanent, or do we want to say that it's something that has to be renewed? You have to get an MBC within a certain period of time.
I would be in favor of it being temporary. That particular stipulation.
And Sandy, when you say temporary, what are you thinking? Like give the person 5 years?
I mean, it takes 5 years. You can take up to 5 years to do the process. So I think 5 years is good.
Okay.
It can take anywhere between 1 and 5 years to do the process.
Darren, this is Winona. If I remember correctly, when we had the work group, this was an issue that we went around and around about because of the fact that they are requiring teachers to have an NBC, but had not really required administrators. So I think I agree with Sandy.
And yeah, I think Dr. Taylor, when you say that, yes, I agree because, and that's where my question came from is what do we do on the teacher side versus the administrative side? And in the administrative side, based on the way it's written, I could easily understand why someone would say there's far less rigor for the administrator in this than there is the teacher. And as long as that's the case, we're never going to improve education, in my opinion. If you allow lower standards for the boss than you do the person who's delivering the instruction. All right, any other comments? All right, so Kelly, if the board is in favor of this, probably the best thing to do now would just be to introduce a, trying to figure out the best way to do this. Would the board want to take a vote on a recommendation to add to something to number 2? That would be the direction I think we would need to go. All right, Sandra, would you feel comfortable phrasing this as a proposal for a recommendation to add to number 2, and then we could open it for discussion and then take a vote?
So I propose a recommendation to add a stipulation to, do we just say number 2 of the, how do you want me to state that? Of the proposed waiver process? That we add that within 5 years, the person needs to have their national board certification.
I second that.
All right, and that was seconded by?
Kim Moore.
Okay, Kim Moore, thank you. I was trying to see it lights up green and I have to look really quick before it goes off. Kelly, is that wording adequate for you?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we have the proposal, we have a second. Do we need to do a roll call?
Up to you.
Sean?
You can.
Okay. Kelly, can you take us through a roll call?
Absolutely. I'm just going to go the way that I see you on my screen. Mr. Hornbeck.
Yes, I'm in favor of that.
Dr. Shockley.
Yes, I'm in favor.
Dr. McGee.
Yes, I'm in favor.
Dr. Gartland.
In favor?
Ms. Poirier.
Yes, in favor.
Ms. Carpenter.
Yes.
Bacon.
In favor.
Ms. Cordalis.
In favor?
Dr.
Yes, in favor.
Ms. Stanton.
In favor.
Ms. Yoho.
In favor.
Dr. Taylor.
Yes.
Moore. Kim Moore.
In favor.
Dr. Dyson.
In favor.
Ms. Hanley.
In favor.
And I will abstain.
Okay, so that passes.
Did you get Dr. Kirby?
Yes, she called me.
Got her.
Dr. Taylor looks out for me.
All right, I've noted that. So make sure I got this right. Recommend a stipulation to condition number 2 that within 5 years of assignment, the individual must earn an NBC. Did I get that right?
Yes, thank you.
Got it.
Perfect. All right, so now I think we're ready for number 3.
Number 3, the candidate was in an assistant principal role in Maryland prior to July 1, 2029, and has demonstrated 3 years of effective performance evaluations as an assistant principal. All right. Giving waiting time, getting my light to turn on. All right. All right, moving on to number 4. And this one, I believe, is going to be a moot point because of the interpretation that the AIB recently publicized. The candidate was in a principal role in Maryland prior to July 1st, 2029, and has demonstrated 3 years of effective performance evaluations as a principal. And then finally, the candidate, and this is where we're explicitly kind of calling out that out-of-state professional. The candidate has 5 years of effective performance evaluations as a principal in another state. That was the last condition the work group recommended.
Kelly, can you go back to number 4 and explain what you meant with the AIB?
Sure. So in a recent meeting, the AIB did announce that they interpret the law to mean that a principal who is in their principal assignment prior to July 1st, 2029 is not an individual who then needs to go get an MBC. It's individuals who step into that principalship July 1st, 2029 or after. So when we did our work as the statewide work group, we did not have that information. So we made recommendations in the event that it was going to apply to all sitting principals.
All right, thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
If I may, at the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned that there had been questions about out of state, for example, principals, and this is where that came up again because it reads that the candidate was in a principal role in Maryland. And so there was just, again, some suggestions about whether or not that needs to read in Maryland or if they could be from another state. So I just want to bring that to the group because that also came up.
All right, good point. Anything else? All right, so Kelly, what's our next steps on this?
So the next step is very much like what occurred with the induction regulations. I will draft, based on these notes, I will draft a memorandum from Chair Hornbeck to President Michael, and I will send it to Chair Hornbeck to review it, make sure that I've reflected the conversation accurately. He will sign it and we'll shoot it over to the State Board of Education and they will consider that when at the point where we go to the State Board and talk about this recommended criteria. That has not yet been scheduled, but when it does, that is when they will review that memorandum at the same time.
And then I'm assuming after the State Board weighs in, is that the point where we would begin to draft COMAR?
That's my assumption. My assumption is that eventually whatever criterion is approved by the State Board will be regulated.
Okay. All right. Well, we're making progress on that. I think the work group would be proud.
It was a lot of work. And
It was a lot of work.
Those of you on the call, and I know that Nikki isn't with us today, but she was also on the work group. Thank you so much for volunteering your time. It was a more extensive amount of time than we had originally anticipated, but we had a lot of things to talk about. So thank you to Dr. Taylor. Thank you to Chair Hornbeck. Am I missing anyone? Thank you to Nikki.
All right. All right. So now let's see. We are at 10:36. I'll tell you what. We were scheduled for a break at 11:05, so we've got some time. All right. So I'll tell you what. Let's go through the next part, which is the permission to publish, and we have 3 different things here. So you'll have COMAR 13A1201, 04, 13A120402, and 13A120502. And you'll see those documents also have been handed out along with the notations at the side. And if you want to bring those up, let me just give everybody a chance to do that.
And the document is gonna, the top of the document is gonna say 13A120104. If you're looking online.
Looks like this.
Okay. So there are several amendments, and I will walk you through each of them. We brought this item as an item for discussion in a previous month, and then we had talked about it back in the summer. We had to pause on promulgating these regulations because some of them were already being promulgated as part of the package that was just adopted by this board and the state board in December and January. So now that they are done being promulgated, the plan was to immediately bring these back because now we're talking about those regulations that affect that special education coursework that is required at initial licensure by every specialist in every administrator area. And we've heard from several individuals that this was causing a challenge to hire. Specifically, we heard social workers specifically, I think administrators specifically, who just did not have this 3 semester hours of credit at the time that they apply. So this board, we talked about, I think, 4 different options that we could do, and the board landed on what you see in front of you today, and that is expanding the use of the temporary professional license. So let's go ahead and go through the amendments, starting with 0.04, issuance and type of licenses. So the first thing we have to do is we have to tweak that definition of temporary professional license because it's no longer only issued for teachers. And so you're going to see some red text in brackets there. Now this is going to allow us later in the regulations to use this license for those specialists and those administrators that we'll talk about in a second. So keep going down to the second page. We are in the highlighted section now. This is me just using this opportunity to clarify. Still learning a lot of lessons, I know, and we've talked about this previously. A lot of confusion around this regulation for our licensure partners across the state. So this is our attempt to clarify, and then I'll walk you through in each chapter. This is aligned to some language in each of the chapters. So what this says is that an educator who meets the eligibility requirements to advance to either a professional license or an advanced professional license, and then it cites where you do that, shall retain all the endorsements listed on that existing license. So what we were experiencing across the state were a lot of questions about, well, logistically, what happens, and I'll use myself as an example. You know, I start out and I have a teaching license and I have an initial professional teaching license. And then somewhere along the way in that initial teaching license, I also decide to become a reading specialist. So now I have, let's say, special ed and reading specialist. And I get my 3 years in the classroom. And so I'm eligible to move to that professional license with that 3 years, or I've gone through an induction program. Either way, I can move to that professional license. The question was, well, wait a minute, now does your reading specialist license kind of hang back as an initial? And now you've got 2 credentials with 2 different validity dates and 2 separate renewals, and what a mess. So that was never the intention. And this is our attempt to clean that up. So this kind of calls out like, nope, you can take it with you as long as you meet the qualifications for that advanced credential. All of your endorsements follow that credential. Any questions about that?
Would that be applied retroactively if there are professionals who have one of their licensure areas fall off when they advance? Or would that need special language? Like if somebody has already gone from initial to professional or APL and was in this circumstance where both of their licensure areas or endorsement areas did not progress through, would they be able to get those added like now retroactively?
They could, but we have communicated as much as humanly possible that no one should be doing this. So, you know, we trained our licensure partners to take all the endorsements, but we wanted to make sure that it was clarified in regulation. So if you find someone that for whatever reason, it didn't follow them, absolutely, they should contact the LEA or contact my office and we'll handle it.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, moving on to 13A120402. Now we're in the licenses of specialist chapter. And we see an addition here under types of specialist licenses under that temporary professional. This is where we're carving out for the specialist that if an applicant has not completed that 3 semester hours of special education coursework, but they have every other requirement listed in that licensure area, the local school system or non-public special education facility or state-operated school can issue the temporary professional license. And we know from chapter 1 that it is a duration of 2 years. It is non-renewable. So then they have that time to get that course, and they certainly don't have to wait, nor should they wait the 2 years, because I'm sure there's going to be some type of benefit to advance to that, whatever next professional license is. So certainly don't have to wait for that credential to expire. As soon as they take that course, they should be applying for an advancement. Okay, next, kind of going back to that clarification piece, you see this text in red as a specialist. This kind of is what was causing all of that like angst about do all the endorsements follow, because now we've got this chapter that inadvertently set up a situation where it's like, oh, well, the performance has to be in the area of the endorsement, and that really was not the intention. So again, we're pulling this out. It is 3 years of effective performance. If it is as a teacher and you've got both of those endorsement areas, they're both going to follow you. Next, in 13A120502, this is going to be identical to what we just looked at for specialists, but now we're talking about administrators and supervisors. Again, carving out the temporary professional for them, because previously there was no instance when they could be issued this credential. So this is brand new language in this chapter, chapter. And then finally, again, you're going to see in red, we remove that explicit administrative or supervisory experience for the 3 years of effective performance, as I just discussed for specialists. And that is all. That is the amendments in their entirety. Again, the purpose of these amendments is twofold. One is to clarify and clean up what we just discussed with regard to advancement. And then the other piece is to allow individuals who are applying for specialist and administrator, supervisor licensure to have and hold that temporary professional license temporarily if they are employed. And that is the only thing that they have not accomplished, is that 3 semester hours of special education. So at this point, I am asking the Professional Standards Board to grant permission to publish these regulations for public comment in the Maryland Register.
All right, and Kelly, thank you so much for your work on this. You know, we had some pretty robust conversations about this several meetings ago, and the board gave lots of recommendations, and it was wonderful how you incorporated all of those in. So I think we found a good solution to everything. Let me open it up for any kind of discussion or questions before we make a move. Anybody with any questions, comments? All right, so Kelly, I'm assuming we can move to adopt all 3 of these at once. We don't have to do it one by one. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'll entertain a motion now to adopt these 3.
I
So
move to
moved.
adopt.
Go ahead, Deb. I'll second your motion.
I move to adopt the 3 for permission to publish.
And that would be 13A120104, 13A120402, and 13A120502. All right, seconded by Dr. Taylor. All right, I think we can just do a roll call on that. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, any
Aye.
opposed? I'm sorry, any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, Kelly, they're approved. Yay. All right, so we're just a little bit ahead of time. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and take a, how about a 10-minute break? We'll come back at 11 o'clock. Is that good for everybody? All right, so let's break till 11. I'll see you in a bit. All right, everybody, welcome back. We'll give it a couple of minutes for everybody to get settled in. All right, so up next on our agenda is COMAR 13A1206. That's the one that's labeled disciplinary action. You'll see that we got a transmittal memo that looks like this, that sort of explains the background and the process. And then under that, the document is the one that looks like that, if you can see it on camera. So if you want to make sure you get those two documents up, that would be good, especially the one where the COMAR is located. It'll say 13A1206 .00 at the very top. And then under that, it'll say 13A, State Board of Education, Subtitle 12, Educator License is what you're looking for. All right, so I'll give everybody a second to bring that up. And you'll also recall we got public comment from this from MSC at the start of the meeting. All right, I'm assuming everyone is ready. Kelly, if you are, can you walk us through this? And I think we might need a little bit of clarification on some of the legal points from Sean as well.
Sounds good. So I'm kind of just going to take a step back quickly and let the board know why these regulations were amended and why we're here today asking for permission to publish for public comment. So at my office had the opportunity to work with the Office of the Inspector General of Education during an investigation that they conducted. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of that investigation, but one of the results of those investigations were that they recommended that we clarify some of our language in regulation. And so a lot of what you're going to see that I'm going to take you through is terminology changes. There is a change in the terminology from charge to grounds. There's a change in the terminology or an addition in terminology of petition. So really trying to clarify as much as possible the language associated with disciplinary action of a license, because there was an idea that, you know, locals could be confused when using the word charge, because charge can also mean, as everyone knows, you know, being charged with a crime, right? And so the suggestion was made by a local that, you know, we might not always know when to recommend disciplinary action on a license because we're focused on like a criminal charge. And that was not the intent. And so, you know, of course, we want to clarify that. So the majority of the amendments are to just go through all of the chapters that have the word charge and change it to grounds. The definition, as you're going to see on that first page of grounds, is the same, it's a little bit cleaner, but it should be in alignment with what charge was formally defined as. And then you're going to see the addition of petition. And this means the written request for denial, suspension, or revocation that we get from a local school system. Sometimes my office has to do it. Sometimes the Office of Child Support has to do it. So wanting to clarify that is, we're going to call it a petition moving forward. So again, because we were like a request, it just wasn't very clear. So an opportunity to clean these up. The other amendment you're going to see is really what Ms. Sapia's public comments were associated with. And so I'm going to jump really quickly to, it is under 13A 120603. And that is highlighted at the top. It says petition for disciplinary action or denial. Within that regulation, if you scroll down to I, placing an alert on an educator's record. So this section isn't new, but what you're going to see is a new B under I1. So I'm going to read the entire section. Placing an alert on an educator's record. The department may place an alert on a licensure record on the request of a local school system, non-public school, state agency, or on its own accord if an educator. And I want to note the on its own accord piece here because it's going to make sense in a minute. I also want to share with you what that means. So an alert on an educator's record is an internal flag that literally says investigation. So there's a yellow banner that goes within the record of that individual, and it says investigation. This flag is only visible to licensure partners and MSDE licensing specialists that work in the system. This flag in no way is publicized, and it is absolutely not impeding due process. And I will turn to our counsel in a minute to talk more about what due process means.
Kelly?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. When you say licensing partners, what does that mean? You say it's visible to them. Who is a licensing partner?
Great question. So in Maryland, for the last several decades, the Maryland State Department of Education has trained local education agency employees that work in HR to issue licenses on behalf of their employees. I don't know if you know this, but our small but mighty group here at MSDE is 6 strong. So we have 6 licensing specialists, and then we have around, and there are different levels of partners. There are partners that can do everything, and then there are partners that can only issue like renewals of licenses. We have around 150 licensure partners across the state, depending on the size of the LEA. So some LEAs may have an office of people that process licensure applications, and some people may have one person that wears 30 hats, and that's one of their hats. So that's what a licensing partner is, Chair Hornbeck. They're individuals that are trained by the MSDE licensure office to issue licenses in our state system.
Thank you.
Sure, great point. So what you're going to see in the amendments is, as again, this is all about like cleaning up and clarifying. We went through the placing an alert on the educator's record section of this regulation and realized that something that we have done for at least the last 10 years was not transparent in the regulations. And so if you look at what is now C, is facing the suspension or revocation of a license after being informed of a petition by the state superintendent of schools. This is what Ms. Sapia spoke to in her comments. So there are a number of ways that the state superintendent can be informed that there is a recommendation that licensure, that a license be suspended or revoked. And we're now going to call that a petition, right? So that's, you see the change there. An LEA can make that petition, and an LEA makes that petition after they have investigated whatever it is they're investigating, and they have determined that there is grounds for that licensure disciplinary action. We are not and never have required LEAs to make us aware of investigations. They do that in-house. They all have a process to do that. And at the end of that investigation, if it is determined that there are grounds to take action on the license, then what the regulations say in this regulation, in the reporting regulation, is that they must inform the state superintendent of their recommendation. And that is what is a petition. So to Ms. Sapia's comments about this would be an administrative nightmare and it would require LEAs to report investigations, that is not true. That is not the intent of this regulation, nor does it require that. It still says is facing the suspension or revocation of a license after being informed of a petition. Now, what was missing and why we've added this language is there are several mechanisms that have always prompted an investigation. There are legal questions that an applicant has to answer, whether they're renewing or whether they're initially applying for the credential. They have to answer criminal history questions, and they have to answer questions about any disciplinary action on an out-of-state license. If an individual in our automated application system answers yes to any of these 5 questions, the system knows you've got to investigate. So it employs a workflow where it flags the record, It makes the application a read-only application, and it alerts our investigation office, you've got work to do. So there's a process there. So that's one of the ways that that can happen. The second way is that we belong to the NASDAQ, the National Association of State Directors of Teacher Education and Certification. They have an educator clearinghouse that we've discussed in the past. There's a reg for that. It's a national clearinghouse, and it houses all of the disciplinary actions against licenses across the country. So we have a file that is sent to us on a nightly basis that comes into our system. It talks to our system. It identifies anyone that is a match from that file and our licensure system, which is called Teach. And if there is a match, again, there's a workflow to open up an investigation, put a flag on the record, and then it communicates with us that you've got work to do. There's an investigation that needs to take place. And then the third way is the same exact process, only instead of from the clearinghouse, the information would come from the Maryland Sex Offender Registry. So you can see that all of these are about safety. So when we get that hit from the Sex Offender Registry or from the Educator Clearinghouse, it is absolutely imperative that we investigate the matter. And so we have many policies and procedures to do that work. And the first thing that we do when we get that communication is we alert the educator. This has happened. We've become aware of this. If they're employed, at the same time, a letter goes to their employer so that they know, hey, I might have to do something here. If we've got a process for putting someone on administrative leave, they implement that process. It's whatever the local has in place for that. But we're going to conduct the investigation as quickly as possible. And one or two things is going to happen. One, we're going to realize that there's no grounds in Maryland to move forward with disciplinary action. So another letter will go to the educator, potentially their employer, that says, we've investigated, there are no grounds, the flag has been removed, everything's good. During that time, during the investigation, again, no one sees the flag except those that have been trained to issue licenses in our system. The second pathway is we found grounds. We found grounds for taking action against your license. At that point, due process begins, because at that point, we're going to petition the state superintendent and say, this is the recommendation we're making, whether that's coming from the LEA, whether that's coming from my office. At that point, we are going to petition the state superintendent, and that is going to start a workflow of a lot of communication and formal letters to the educator. And then the educator has some decisions to make, whether they want to appeal, whether they want to go through due process, or whether they just want it to let it happen. And there are other regulations that are not before you today that have what that process looks like. So again, I just want to be really clear that the amendment that we're recommending under I does not impede the educator's ability to go through due process. What it does is it is transparent in the regulations. It codifies what we have always done and what we have always communicated with an individual who's being investigated is, we're investigating you. That's what the flag is. You are being investigated. And so we want to be transparent. We don't want to investigate and you don't know that we're investigating you. You know, there's a whole process for that. And even if it's not due process, it's really important for the agency to be transparent. So that is the amendment in a nutshell. But given Ms. Sapia is an attorney, she used legal terms that we're not all familiar with. I know I'm not. I'm going to turn to our counsel and ask Sean to just provide whatever information he think would be helpful for explaining, you know, what is due process? And does he, as our counsel, feel that these amendments are impeding the due process of our educators? Because that's certainly not what we want.
Sure. So just, I think it would be helpful to, I think, as Kelly mentioned, to kind of explain what due process is, because the term is thrown around a lot. Due process is the fundamental principle of law that requires the government to respect one's rights and follow applicable procedures when taking someone's interests to life, liberty, property. The alert that we're talking about, in my view, doesn't implicate due process whatsoever, much less deprive an educator of any due process rights. The reason for that is the alert is entirely internal within the Maryland's licensure system TEACH. As Kelly made very clear, no one sees this alert but MSDE and its licensure partners. And to be clear, MSDE and its licensure partners have every right under the law to ensure that they're all on the same page and all aware when a Maryland educator is being investigated for possible disciplinary action. The law doesn't prohibit a licensing agency from alerting those working under it about a licensee or applicant in the state who's under investigation. I do think, when we're talking about due process, right, I would encourage the board to look at the regulation as a whole. The very next section, Comar 13812, if you go down to number 2 on regulation I, it makes clear the alert doesn't affect the validity of the educator's license. Moving to the next point, number 3, the investigating agency, whether it's the LEA or MSDE, has to inform the department immediately if the grounds for disciplinary action no longer exist. At which point, if you go down to number 4, MSDE must immediately remove the alert. So I think it's important to mention, I don't think we addressed this with Kelly's points, but I do think it's important that the board know the way this alert is crafted. Not only does it not implicate due process, but it's also narrowly tailored for its limited purpose, which is making sure MSDE and its licensure partners are all on the same page regarding disciplinary action investigations, only so long as those investigations exist. So I do want to briefly just address MSEA's comment. I'd encourage the board to look carefully at it and read it carefully. From my reading, it doesn't actually explain any due process rights purported to be infringed by the alert. The only tangential due process comment mentioned therein is the idea of guilty until proven innocent was the term that invokes I think we're all familiar with the presumption of innocence that's found in criminal law. Criminal law, to be clear, criminal law and administrative law, specifically administrative law in the field of professional licensure, are 2 different areas with entirely different legal standards. When someone's charged with a crime, they face penalties of a criminal conviction, a fine, probation, or incarceration, any combination of those. So facing those severe sanctions, we presume anyone charged with a crime is innocent, and the state has to prove those charges beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard of proof in the law. In licensure cases where either an LEA or the department takes action against an educator's license, Maryland regulation, and the regulation is if you go down to 04D, that's where our standard of proof lies for these disciplinary action cases. It requires a burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence. What that means is more likely than not, more than a 50% chance. It's a much lower standard than the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But MSEA's comment doesn't cite any kind of principle of administrative law or licensing law that requires professionally licensed personnel facing disciplinary action to be presumed innocent. And the reason for that is because it doesn't exist. And the reason that doesn't exist is because this is a balance. It is a balance between an individual's right to licensure and right to employment versus the government's interest in protecting the health, safety, and welfare of Maryland students. And that is the critical lens through which to view this regulation. So I want to just wrap up by addressing that point, which is the purpose of this regulation. MSEA argued in its comment, this does nothing to protect students. And I couldn't disagree more on that point. The very purpose of this alert is to ensure that an educator being investigated for possible disciplinary action can't slip through the cracks. we've seen numerous instances where an educator facing disciplinary action in one jurisdiction leaves and goes to a new jurisdiction that's unaware of that pending disciplinary action, whether it be leaving from one county to another, leaving from one state to another. And it happens far too often that when we don't have procedures in place to make sure everyone's aware of these investigations, everyone's aware of potential disciplinary action, that educators who have committed causes under the disciplinary action regulations can gain employment elsewhere and continue to perpetuate bad conduct. The purpose of this alert is to protect Maryland students, to make sure that MSD and its licensure partners are always aware when there is a potential disciplinary action investigation, and it only lasts as long as that investigation takes place. So for those reasons, in my view, this alert really does not implicate due process rights. And I think, again, if the board looks at these regulations as a whole, the disciplinary action regulations, COMAR 13A 1206, the board, as the board probably knows from implementing these regulations over the years, there is ample due process that's afforded to every educator when faced with disciplinary action. And Kelly kind of touched on some of those during her comments. So I'm happy to answer questions if there are specific questions with regard to the concepts of due process and the kind of the legal implications of the alert.
Ms. McGee.
First of all, Sean, thank you. That was incredibly helpful. And I'm sorry I popped my hand up so fast there towards the end, but you were saying something, and I'm old and I can't remember anything, right? And so I'm like, dang, what you just said, which was clear about the difference between what's written and happening here and like the legal criminal, I don't even know, but I want to say it to you this way. I have been on this board. This is my 10th year, right? And I'm privy to a lot of deep explanations by you, and it's awesome. But the average everyday educator or just person is not privy to that. And so I think I don't want to put words into the mouth of the lady who shared earlier, but I'm just wondering if, you know, people see that and they don't have this context and they don't understand it, and there's no little caveat that's kind of explaining the difference between the two, people will possibly assume what they know, and what they know is criminal justice. They know that side of the law. They don't understand this educator side. And so to you and to Kelly, I don't know if there's any way that there can be anything that does, disclaimers I know are not really allowed, but I'm just wondering, because we need a little audio that they can click on and hear that whole thing that you just said, Sean, so that everybody can understand it as well as I understand it now. And that there's no way for anyone to put their own spin or interpretation, because, you know, that's somebody's reputation as a teacher or an educator. And I understand kind of all sides involved now because of you explaining that. So again, thank you for that. And I saw Kelly's hand go right up. So she's going to school me. I'm here for it. Thanks.
Kelly.
I'm not here to school you, but I think that I'm hoping that I can provide some additional context that may make you feel more comfortable. And while you're talking, I'm also thinking, like, you know, is there a way, you know, maybe we need, I'll go back and look at the language on the application, but maybe because there is language on the application, Dr. McGee, maybe that needs to be stronger, you know, like, currently what's happening is we provide a ton of communication to an individual who's being investigated, and that communication is private. It's between the agency and that individual, and we have an office, you know, we have a manager of investigations, and we have an administrative officer who helps conduct the investigations, and those individuals really are on the front line. And as you can imagine, if you're being investigated, you have a lot of questions. So those two individuals, as well as myself, as well as the director of licensure, have a lot of conversations with people just to explain, because you know what? the regs are hard. And even if we had like layman's terms, you know, regulations, like it's still hard. And sometimes you need to talk to somebody. And when you're being investigated, I just don't think there's any substitution for a call because it's scary. So absolutely. So I just want to make sure that I'm transparent with our processes at the agency, and
Right.
certainly there's always room for improvement. And I will go back and look at the application to see, like, is there stronger language we can say, like, up front, like, this is what's going to happen when you
Right.
answer these questions a certain way, like this is, or maybe there's a web page that we can just have like an FAQ about, like, what does it mean if
That's a
I'm
great idea.
you know,
That's a
those
great
are things
idea.
that we can easily do. But I do want to make sure everyone knows that, you know, it's our jobs to
Right.
talk with individuals that are going through this and make sure that they do understand those letters and they do understand all the regulatory language and the due process, because they
Right.
shouldn't have to know. That's our jobs.
Right.
And to be clear, what Kelly just described is procedural due process, right? The importance of understanding the chart, the grounds for disciplinary action, the importance of the department community, like, the person who is facing that potential loss of licensure, being able to fully understand the nature of the proceeding against them, the nature of the allegations, the regulatory basis for action, the procedures in play. That's all part of procedural due process. But this concept, as far as this is more of an investigation concept, which is distinct. One analogy I'd use, to go back to criminal law for a second. Imagine for a moment that we said to, like if a sheriff's office or a police department was investigating an individual. Imagine if we said to that police department, "Hey, you can't tell your sister jurisdictions about this individual you're investigating, because that implicates that individual's due process rights." It's kind of an absurd concept, right? Because it's hamstringing the investigating agency's ability to do their job, to be able to make sure to protect the public safety. So this is all, again, especially in the context of, I mean, in every context, but certainly here in professional licensure, we're balancing the interests of, making sure that every due process right that a licensed individual has is respected, but also balancing the critical interests of the health, safety, and welfare of Maryland students. And when we're talking about investigatory procedures like this one, where no one knows about it save for the 150 licensing personnel in the state, there really isn't that kind of due process right that's implicated.
Any other comments?
I had a question, Darren.
Sure, go ahead.
So when you say under investigation, it's under investigation by possibly the LEA, or is that just by the State Department?
Either. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Kelly.
So in this instance, it could be either, Sandy, but in this instance, we're really talking about MSDE, because LEAs have already established long-standing process where they have their own mechanisms for investigating. We don't require, and the regulations don't require them to tell us when they're investigating. And as Jamie shared during her public comment, she's right. It would be an absolute administrative nightmare if we needed to know about every time an LEA investigated any type of allegation. It's not appropriate for us to know. It's not necessary. The regulations don't require it. And we know that LEAs all have processes in place for that. So it's mostly MSDE, but I will share that is a good example. Like, rarely, thankfully, but sometimes, like our state operated schools and our non-public schools that are also in our reporting reg required to alert us when something happens, they don't have staff, to investigate. They don't have admin leave. They don't have the mechanisms and the workflows in place to they don't have, they're not represented by unions. Their employees are not represented by unions. So they don't have the same mechanisms in place. They rely on us. So a lot of times, I'll get a call from an agency, or I'll get a call from a non-public school that says, like, I don't know what to do. Like, we've had this investigation. We think there's grounds. Like, we kind of need you to step in and help us make sure that we're on the right track here. And that will start in motion an investigation that we kind of do in tandem. So in that instance, we may go ahead and alert, if they haven't already, hopefully they have, alert the educator that they're being investigated, and we kind of take a more hand-holding role in those instances. But as far as LEAs are concerned, like, they know how to do this.
Could I jump in for a second? Sandra, I'm going to turn to you and maybe Debbie Gartland and maybe Ms. McGee. You correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been on the board for quite a while. This is not the first time that this has come up. And in my memory, this has come up before the board at least twice in previous years. And the board has never approved it. And let me kind of walk you through why. Now, I'm not trying to suggest the board should or shouldn't this time, but I want to give some historical context, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong. The concern that often gets raised, and it's one, Sean, that you raised, is that there is a potential for someone to slip through the cracks. They're being investigated. They make an application to another LEA. The LEA doesn't realize they're being investigated, and therefore they get the job. And now that's a potential risk to kids. That's a nightmare that would keep me up at night. I would never want to enable a situation like that. But in the end, the onus is on the LEA that's hiring that person to do a background check on the person, to call and get their previous record. If they don't do that, well, then there's not much they're going to do, because they wouldn't see an alert even if it was on there. So these cases where people slip through the cracks, I think generally, at least the way the previous board has seen this, often happens because the hiring LEA simply doesn't do their job. If they called and asked for a reference from the previous place, they would tell them that they're being investigated. You don't necessarily have to have an alert on someone's file. That does not preclude MSDE or any of the LEAs from communicating to someone else that they're currently being investigated. So you don't necessarily need that alert on there when the person hasn't been, declared guilty. That's something you could communicate, at any point if you wanted to. So I think that fall through the cracks thing is really more the fault of the LEA that's doing the hiring than us. If they're not going to check, I don't know how they would find out. And then the second thing, of course, a person is going to get their due process. If, let's say, there's a student who frivolously charges me with something and I'm marched out of the classroom, which happens frequently, and the grounds are completely baseless, well, yes, there's going to be an investigation. There's nothing that's going to stop, you putting a flag on my file doesn't necessarily stop the investigation. Okay, we get that. The concern is, if a person really is presumed to be innocent until guilty, why would you need the flag in the first place? You'd wait until the due process is finished before you would put it on, because to put a flag on the person's file would sort of assume that we don't know yet, and maybe the person is guilty when oftentimes they're not. Now, granted, they might be cleared, but we have people in HR in each of the LEAs that are doing this. And quite frankly, if you had two candidates that you wanted to move into the career ladder, and one had a flag that disappeared and one did not, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of prejudice, I think, that would come in the mind of the person hiring. You'd rather go with the person who has a completely clean record. So I think there's a stigma, whether we want to say it or not, that can be attached to a person who has a file that has a flag on it, even when it's dropped off, because of the people who've seen it. And it's just not necessary until the investigation is completed. So those, if I'm not mistaken, and the rest of you that are on the board have been here for a long time, those were the primary reasons why we felt we didn't actually need to do this. It would actually be detrimental to the person, especially those people that get charged when they're innocent. Did I miss anything, or did I phrase that correctly? And I'm asking the folks who have been on the board for a while.
Those have been our concerns in the past, Darren.
Ken, I'm seeing Chris nod her head. I think we just felt as though you have the mechanisms that you need. If the LEAs are doing their job, and we assume that they are, that this is not necessary. And if you're not trying to cast at least some kind of doubt, or at least, and I realize that wouldn't be the intent specifically, but if there's no way to put a flag on someone's file without somehow casting a little bit of doubt, that's why it's on there. You're saying, ooh, be careful. We're putting a flag on when the investigation isn't over. Now, granted, due process is going to continue, but there's still a red flag that's on there when the person when the investigation is not over yet. And it's hard to unremember that flag if you work in a county and you're in the HR department. And if you have a rough set of students and you get more than one, which some teachers I know and they're excellent teachers and have, it's got to stay in a person's mind. So I think it's that concern that, one, we haven't really needed it to weed teachers out. And two, it does produce a stigma, whether we think it does or not, for innocent teachers, that we've been reticent to ever vote on this and approve it. And I don't think the concern is really over. I don't hear any concerns over the vocabulary change from charge to grounds and petition. I think those are necessary. It's more this flag that I think concerns us. All right, and I'll open it up for more discussion.
I just wanted to add that captures the sentiment of the recent discussions on this topic as well.
May I?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, so I do want to address a few points. So I will tell you, in the last 10 years, we have never asked to add this language. And we did have this discussion at length when we adopted these regulations, because that's when we added this section about the educator flag. So lots of robust discussion during that time. We didn't have this language because, quite frankly, it was my oversight. I wasn't thinking logistically and I didn't add it. So that I can assure you. I want to remind you all that we license people all day long who are not employed with local school systems in Maryland. And it is our responsibility to make sure those individuals are not provided with a license if there is a cause or grounds that prevents them from having that license. And so we have to investigate. So this is what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to be done. Let's say we get a hit from the Maryland Sex Offender Registry. It's on me. It's my record. We get it today. I've got 2 people in my office that do investigations for the state. Let's say it takes them a month to go through the entire investigation. Let's say they're really fabulous and it takes a week. That's a week too long to give me a license, because down the hall, my applications is going to go through. They're quick. So there's no mechanism for my staff to say, oh, Kelly's on the sex offender registry. My colleague is doing an investigation. Can't let that happen. And it's been the way that we've done business since I've been at the agency, 2014. We've had a flag on the record internally in our licensure system since 2014. And maybe before that, I don't know, I wasn't here. So I just want to be crystal clear that we are not just talking about individuals who are employed and have representation and are lucky enough to be employed with an LEA that has the capacity to put someone on administrative leave and do everything that they do before they recommend a petition to the state superintendent.
All right, additional questions or comments?
I just want to respond to one point briefly with regard to, the comment of the harm, the perceived harm to educators with regard to the stigma. And again, I think it's important to bring it back to balancing, right? Everything is a balance. I can't speak to whether or not an LEA I don't even know, Kelly, if an LEA can see an alert that has been removed, if a licensure partner.
No, they can see the history of any investigation if they dig into the record, and there are certain licensure specialists that have that ability. Hiring partners don't have that ability.
So I didn't know that piece of the puzzle, but even assuming for the sake of argument that there is some stigma or some perceived harm associated with an educator who had this alert placed in the record at some time, again, I would encourage the board to balance that against the risk of a teacher falling through, like a bad actor falling through the cracks. because I understand. I agree with you, Darren, that would keep me up at night too. And that is the risk that comes with not having this alert. This is the concern would be that I understand your point to your point about if every LEA is doing their jobs perfectly, in a perfect world, there is no case that falls through the cracks. But we don't live in a perfect world, and the purpose of this alert is to make sure that every certification partner and MSD all are operating with the same information, that they're speaking with one voice, that are all on the same page, and all are aware of educators in this state who either are licensed or applying for licensure and who are under investigation. And in my view, if this alert does not exist, if the department cannot, in a world where the department cannot issue that alert, and make sure that everyone's on the same page, I do think it invites additional risk that more individuals will fall through the cracks. I think this is a procedural safeguard against that prospect. And so it is a balance on whether or not that benefit in terms of protecting the health, safety, and welfare of Maryland students, which really is the guiding purpose of this, the North Star of this regulation, the set of regulations, whether that weighs more heavily than the potential risk to educators in terms of that perceived stigma. And that's really the purview of this board to decide with regard to this proposed regulatory change. But that is the decision we have to make in terms of that balance. And with that, I'll conclude.
Yeah, I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate your comments too, Kelly, and all the explanations. I agree with Ms. McGee. Dr. McGee, this has really been important that we go through and we think this way. What always strikes me so interesting about conversations like this is that everybody is trying to do the right thing. That whether you believe this is a good thing and a good piece of COMAR to pass, or you think maybe it's flawed, everybody's taking a position because they're trying to do the right thing. So there's a certain nobleness in the way we're handling this, and I really do appreciate that. Everyone's heart is in the right place. The last thing any of us want is for an unqualified teacher that can do tremendous harm to a kid to ever be allowed to do that. So yes, we all want to make sure we have safeguards, but we also want to make sure that the process is fair and that we're safeguarding the rights of teachers who routinely go through a hellish nightmare of being charged for doing things that they've never done. And that frequency is just happening all the time. And I hate to say it, but in the current political environment we're in, we're seeing people marched out of their offices for all kinds of things and initiatives that frankly this board has often supported. So, we're in tough times, and that makes these discussions even harder. I'm going to make a suggestion, but this is completely at the pleasure of the board. We're bringing this with a permission to publish today, but we just got this in our packets for this meeting. I'm wondering if, since there's so many different viewpoints on this, we might be best served by tabling a vote to publish to our next meeting. And that would give all of us a chance to go back, check with our constituent groups, run the language past them, get viewpoints of people who are in HR, people that are working with teachers and so forth, our superintendents and so forth, and just kind of come back with some additional viewpoints to sort of help us out. So my recommendation is we table it. Now, if someone wants to make a motion to publish today, that's perfectly fine. I would entertain that, but I think we're best served by holding off a bit. But I leave that to the pleasure of the board, and I'll open it up for your thoughts and comments.
Before people start commenting, I also want to throw out another option. And so I'm looking at the language and I'm wondering if, because we keep talking, it sounds like the board's concerns are really stemming from that LEA employee who is going through the process internally and not wanting to jump the gun and inform MSDE and have their licensure record flagged as being investigated. What if the language read is being investigated by the department to determine whether grounds exist for denial or disciplinary action under regulation? Would that make this board feel more comfortable? So that's also an option, whether you want to vote on it today or next month. We're at the point now where we can change the language. We haven't started the promulgation process. So I don't see an issue with adding the terminology by the department to make it clear that these are times that MSDE is completing the investigation.
All
And
right, so
whenever we're notified by the sex offender registry, NASDAQ, like those are things that come directly to the agency.
And if it's been elevated by an LEA, in addition to that, so like if they bring their investigation to the state, then you would then flag it?
No, so if we change it to is being investigated by the department, then we would fall back to C. And so let's say, and this does happen, let's say that, you know, I'm gonna pick on Frederick because I'm looking at Frederick's superintendent. Frederick says, you know, oh, Kelly, we're investigating Sean, and we think there could be cause here, grounds here. I'm gonna say, okay, well, complete your investigation. And, you know, going by the reporting regulations, this is what you're required to do to report your petition to the state superintendent. But then if let's say the LEA says, well, are you gonna flag the record? I would cite C and I would say, well, where's the petition? So that may solve the angst here.
all right, so that would mean adding, the way it would work would be on page 4 of the reg, we would go to I, placing an alert on educator record. B would then read is being investigated by the department to determine, and that's what the potential fix is, correct?
Yeah, that's my first thought.
That might work. All right, so again, I would make the recommendation that we take this back to our colleagues. Talk about the proposal to maybe fix the concern, see how that works, and then bring this back for discussion or a vote at our next meeting. Is there anybody on the board who would object to that? Okay, sounds good. Then I think we'll just move this as an agenda item for our next meeting, and we all have some homework to do on this. And Kelly, thanks so much. You're always so good to work with our concerns and things, both you and Sean. I really do appreciate it. This board is so thoughtful, I think, in the way they deliberate and so forth. And again, I really just reiterate the fact that we all have the student's best interest in mind. That's what drives all of us. So none of these discussions are ever adversarial. And that's what I like so much about being on this board. We all want what's best and we're willing to work till we get it. So that's
Joy had her hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I missed that. Jump right in.
It's okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that when we're, and I apologize if this was already stated, but when we're talking about that piece under I 1B for investigated for grounds exist for denial or disciplinary, we're only talking about things that are defined earlier in the regulation. We're not talking about a teacher, there's a dispute of, let's say a teacher pushed a student and they're put on administrative leave by their district to be able to then investigate. We're not talking about those kinds of things. We're only talking about, because I think to earlier points about clarification, I think that that clarification is helpful because we're not talking about any sort of administrative leave or any sort of investigation that an LEA or otherwise might be involved in. We're only talking about the specific things listed earlier in the statute, correct?
That's exactly correct. So if you look at O2, the grounds, we're only talking about what's listed in that regulation. So yeah, that's absolutely right, Joy. Like there are many other reasons why an LEA may conduct an investigation, but only those that lead to a requirement to take action on a license per the grounds in O2 is what would be elevated to the state.
All right, any other questions? All right, then moving right along, the next thing on our agenda is reading instruction assessments, overview of pass rates. And if you're opening this, the document will read PSTEB reading assessment pass rates, and it looks like this. It's PowerPoint.
So before, I'd like to introduce Addison Smith, who is our educator data coordinator, who we are so lucky to have. I don't think you've met Addison previously, but I'm sure you'll be seeing her again. And just as a reminder, the purpose of this presentation during last month's board meeting, the board asked specifically for MSDE to pull passing rate data for our two approved reading instruction assessments. And they are the Pearson Evaluation Services Foundations of Reading Assessment and the ETS Praxis Teaching Reading Elementary Assessment. So just as a reminder for everyone, these are the assessments that have been, the requirement for the assessment has been in place since 2018, and it requires any teacher who is licensed in early childhood education, elementary education, special education, or ESOL to demonstrate proficiency providing reading instruction by passing an assessment. So that is what we are talking about today. These two assessments are the assessments that have been approved by the State Board of Education to serve this purpose. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Smith.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I can still say good morning for another 9 minutes. My name is Addison Smith. I'm the Educator Data Coordinator here in the Division of Educator Effectiveness. In addition to what Kelly was saying, I would like to remind you all that the Foundations of Reading Assessment was approved by the State Board December 3rd of the previous year, so just has been in action for about 2 months. So I just wanted to get that out there. So first, we are going to look at the Foundations of Reading passing rates at a passing score of 240. So the data that we have for both assessments is over the same time frame. This is from September 1st, 2019 to August 31st, 2024, so 5 years of data across both assessments. This is national data, as you can see by the 27,811 examinees. So that information is pertinent as well. So I wanted you all to see that candidates of color in both exams are passing at a lower rate nationally than white candidates. Overall, the first-time passing rate is 62%. That will jump up to 67% for all examinees when you look at their best attempt. And that is with the Foundations of Reading with the passing score of 240. Then we have the Praxis Teaching Reading Elementary passing rates, which is a passing score of 159. This is the one that Maryland has had for longer, and has been in existence longer, as you can see with the 40,000 examinees. So as I noted on the previous slide, there is a jump in passing when you take this exam more times. And similarly to the Foundations of Reading assessment, there is also the disparity between candidates of color and white teaching candidates. And I will open it up for any questions. I know you guys have sat with the numbers for a little bit already this past week.
I have a question. I'm up here. So thank you so much for doing this, Addison. We were just talking about this last night in seminar. I said, hold off and I'll give you more information. So the best score passing rate, do you happen to know? Did you dig down to see whether or not that was the second attempt or third attempt?
No, when I received this data from Pearson and ETS, they do not give me the average number of attempts.
Okay, and thank you. And one other question I think that we asked last month is the tree apparently takes up to a month to get the scores back. Do you have any idea how long it takes for the Foundation's scores to be received?
I do not. I can look into that for you.
Addison, look up both, please, because I'm surprised to hear a month. I thought it was a 2-week turnaround. So let's ask both vendors.
Yes.
Good morning, Addison. I think still, yes. So thank you for sharing this. Also, thank you for being so helpful on TPAR. Just want to put that out there and on the records. My question is, do you know if Pearson and the other vendor, Pearson and ETS give state level data, and if they don't, if which I would imagine that they would to a state agency. But also just for the purposes of preparing candidates and also thinking about our in-service educators, I would be curious if a request for the scores for elementary, for ESOL, and for special education and for early childhood education would be available, only because I think it would help programs and LEAs understand what additional support could be offered to a particular specialization. I think that the state could benefit from that. I think the LEAs could benefit from that. I think that it's a way to really drill down and understand, in particular, since we're including some PK-12 licensure areas that also, have a secondary experience that doesn't definitely cover some of the nuances that one would find in early childhood and elementary. So I think knowing that is going to help us. And then finally, if there are data, I know that the tree was also adopted, as I just talked about secondary recently. If there has been a crosswalk to the science of reading, giving the push for science of reading on these assessments, I'm thinking yes, since it gained popularity. But if there's any information that we can share as we join the state in the efforts to credential students, faculty, and staff on the science of reading, that would also be helpful, I think, in carrying that message. So thank you, Addison.
Thank you, Dr. Shockley, and I noted all of that.
And I'm gonna jump in and we'll piggyback this. So absolutely, I think those were all great ideas, and we will absolutely get you the documentation that both vendors provide to align to the science of reading. I do want to jump back and just explain that yes, there is absolutely statewide data. We have access to statewide data. We don't have, sorry, hold on. We don't have to rely on ETS and Pearson to pull that data. We have access to it, as do our institutions of higher education. So when we drill down to the area of licensure, which I agree, that's very relevant. One of the things that I know my educator preparation program approval team is starting to do as part of their review process and as part of reviewing the annual reports that are due is sitting down with institutions of higher education to take a deep dive into their data to say, okay, and that's absolutely when we can look at licensure areas, because that is such an important part, right, of the program of review. So please know that is on our radar, and that is going to be a part of our processes moving forward. And Addison will be involved in that work.
Thank you. And having our own is helpful, but because we also have thousands of conditionally certified teachers who are maybe going through various routes, that's why I was thinking of a state effort or some state data to kind of see where all of us could grow and learn and move our candidates across backgrounds and ethnicities to these passing scores that they will need for a licensure. Thank you so much.
Can I jump in and ask whether or not we could further disaggregate based on undergraduate degrees sought versus somebody maybe who's teaching or needs to take this or coming in from that? So just to see whether those data are different.
I can look into that.
Thank you so much. You didn't know we were going to give you even more work, huh? We appreciate it, though. It's great information to know.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we let Addison go? All right, thank you so much for your presentation. We certainly do appreciate it. Thanks for coming. All right, we are quickly winding down. I think now we have to set our March agenda. So I'll look to Kelly. I have obviously the disciplinary action 13AO1206 that we decided to table. And I believe we said we wanted to have a legislative update if possible. And what else do you have, Kelly?
Well, just the normal every month things I have. I do have the legislative update. I do have disciplinary action. I believe that we've identified another area that requires correction. Let me check my notes. Yes. So the superintendent regulation, there is either an error or a clarification needed. I don't remember off the top of my head. But that I will work on and bring back to the board so you can see it. That's all I have.
Okay, well, I had another question too. Usually after January, we generally get a staffing report where we see teacher shortages and things like that. Does your department have anything like that that's finished now?
Yeah, so we are presenting a workforce update to the state board on the 25th. And I can bring that to this board in March. It is not an entire supply and demand. It is really just a focus on our educator workforce. But I could throw in some other slides about supply, but yeah, I'm happy to do that in March.
All right, if that's the pleasure of the board, I think we would like that. I'm kind of wondering, you can address this too, about the accuracy of it, because so many LEAs have had slashes in their funding, like they need X number of teachers, but then they have to put in a teacher hiring freeze. So it looks like they're fully staffed when in reality they're not. Is that kind of a factor in this year's numbers?
No, there were vacancies. I mean, I think there were 14, don't quote me. I think there are around 1,400 teacher vacancies, and then there are around 6,000 conditionally licensed folks. And we look at both of those metrics when we think about supply.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I would definitely love to see that. I think that's something the board always appreciates. So good, we'll put that on the agenda. Anybody else have any ideas? Yep, Melissa?
Can I also ask, can we have like a breakdown for the MBCs across the state? I'm just curious with
Absolutely.
the focus we had.
All right, anybody else? All right, well, as always, if something comes to mind, you can certainly email Kelly directly if there's something you think that needs to be on the agenda, or you can reach out to either of us and we'll make sure that works. Dr. Shockley as well. All right. Is there anything else for the good of the group before we adjourn?
Just a question, I might have missed this. Did we go over the public comment from the other person, the parent who sent in comment for this meeting? I may have missed it.
I think it was provided, Darren mentioned it after we heard from Ms. Sapia. So when the board gets public comment that's written, it's distributed. We don't typically have a discussion, but I think that's up to Chair Hornbeck to decide whether if you want to carve out an agenda item.
Ken, I would kind of recommend maybe that Dr. Shockley and I, if you don't mind, kind of get together, go over some of the public comment with Kelly and so forth, and just kind of explore that and sort of see what we'd like to do in regard to that. Is that all right with you, Dr. Shockley?
Absolutely, no problem at all.
All right, we'll reach out together and do that. But yeah, I had mentioned at the last meeting too that I think there was something that we definitely needed to look into more in a discussion. We haven't done that yet. All right, good point. All right, anyone else? All right, without objection, then I will adjourn our meeting at 12:04 p.m. Everyone have a wonderful rest of the day, and hopefully you don't have to drive anywhere. One of the nice things about meeting online. All right, everyone, I will see everyone next month. Thank you all.